The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as I poured the rich, dark liquid into 2 identical mugs. I added the creamer just the way he liked it, stirring slowly as my mind raced. My hand trembled slightly, but I steadied it, inhaling deeply before forcing a soft smile onto my lips. "Made you a special coffee, honey," I called over my shoulder, keeping my tone light, cheerful. James was already sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples, looking exhausted as usual. My husband had a way of carrying his exhaustion like a badge of honor, as if the weight of the world was solely on his shoulders. He smiled at me, but there was something hollow in his expression. Or maybe I was just imagining things. "How sweet," he murmured, taking the mug from my hands. I turned back to the counter, pretending to rinse the spoon as I took a steadying breath. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribcage, but I refused to let it show. This was fine. Everything was fine. Danielle sat across from James, scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to either of us. My sister had never liked James, and honestly I never understood why. He was quiet, methodical, predictable. Nothing about him warranted the kind of disdain she threw his way. Maybe she found him weak. Maybe she thought I deserved better. She certainly wouldn't feel that way if she knew what I had been up to. I stole a glance at my husband as he brought the cup to his lips. My stomach twisted, but I smiled through it. This was the right choice. The only choice. I had spent weeks agonizing over the details, poring over articles, watching videos, calculating the perfect balance. Too much would be suspicious. Too little wouldn't be enough. I had to get it just right. I had to be free. "Lauren, did you put too much creamer in this?" Danielle's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned slowly, masking my confusion. "Huh." Danielle wrinkled her nose, holding the cup away from her lips. "It tastes weird." A sharp pang of dread coiled in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "Oh, it's just a new blend," I said smoothly, moving toward the table. I watched as James set his own mug down, his expression unreadable. His hands rested calmly on the table, but there was something deliberate about the way he moved, like he knew something I didn't. And then I noticed Danielle's mug. It was in the wrong place. My breath caught in my throat as realization set in, my vision narrowing on the cup she was holding. I turned to James, and for the first time in years I felt true fear grip me. He knew. And now it was too late. My mouth went dry. James was watching me, his gaze steady, unreadable. Danielle took another sip, her face scrunching slightly at the taste, but she kept drinking. My sister wasn't one to waste anything, especially not coffee. I wanted to stop her, to slap the cup from her hands, to scream, to do something, but I couldn't move. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. James was the one who was supposed to drink it. He was supposed to be the one shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his skin growing clammy, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He was supposed to be the one clutching his stomach, eyes wide with confusion as I comforted him, my voice calm, assuring him everything would be fine. Danielle was never part of the plan. I forced myself to sit down, my hands trembling as I gripped my own mug. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what had gone wrong, how James had known, how he had switched them without me noticing. Or worse, had he known from the beginning? A bead of sweat trailed down my spine. James picked up his cup and took a sip, his lips curling into the smallest hint of a smirk. My heart pounded against my ribs. He wasn't supposed to be calm. He wasn't supposed to be sitting there, completely in control. "I think I put too much sugar in it," I said, trying to sound casual, to explain away the strange taste. Danielle groaned. "It's not sugar. Something else. It's bitter." She set the cup down and massaged her temples. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. It was starting. Danielle exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly as if the kitchen lights had suddenly become too bright. "I don't feel right," she muttered, pressing a hand against her forehead. I swallowed hard. "Maybe you're just tired. You were out late last night." Danielle waved me off, pushing away from the table. "No, it's different. My stomach." She stopped, inhaling sharply through her nose, eyes fluttering shut. My mind raced. I knew what was coming next. The drowsiness, the dizziness, the sharp cramping in her gut. It would escalate slowly at first, then all at once. I wanted to stand up, to run to her, to act concerned. But James was still watching me. He hadn't said a word. Why wasn't he saying anything? I turned to him, trying to keep my breathing steady. James, I said softly, hoping to gauge his reaction to see if he was panicking like I was. He simply took another sip of his coffee and smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. My stomach flipped. What's wrong, Lauren? He asked, setting his cup down, fingers drumming lightly against the table. You seem nervous. I opened my mouth, then closed it. My mind was spinning, trying to process what was happening, trying to grasp the shift in control. James wasn't supposed to act like this. He was supposed to be oblivious. Danielle groaned again, this time louder, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. Her breathing had become shallow, uneven. I needed to do something. Danielle, maybe you should lie down, I said, my voice softer now, filled with just enough concern to mask my panic. She shook her head, but her eyes were unfocused. I just need a second. James leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly as he studied me. You seem really interested in how she's feeling, Lauren, he mused. Why's that? I snapped my eyes back to him. She's my sister, I shot back. Of course I care. James hummed, dragging his fingertips along the rim of his coffee cup. Right, he said. Of course. I clenched my jaw. What are you getting at? Before he could answer, Danielle let out a sharp gasp. She shoved herself away from the table, stumbling backward. Her hand flew to her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Oh my God, she stammered, her voice trembling. My chest tightened. James didn't move. He didn't rush to her side, didn't try to help. He just sat there watching. He knew. Somehow, someway he had figured it out. And now he was waiting for me to break. Danielle staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale. A thin sheen of sweat forming on her forehead. I wanted to help her. I needed to. But I couldn't move. Because James was still watching me. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. Observing every twitch of my fingers, every flicker in my expression. Every little reaction I couldn't suppress. And worst of all, he was enjoying it. I swallowed hard. Danielle, you should sit down, I said, my voice even. Danielle let out a pained breath, shaking her head. No, she stopped mid-sentence, her eyes going wide. Her hand flew to her mouth, and in an instant, she turned and bolted for the downstairs bathroom. The sound of her retching hit me like a slap. I gripped the table, knuckles white. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The moment the bathroom door slammed shut, I turned to James. What did you do? I hissed under my breath. He arched a brow, feigning innocence. Me. He gestured toward his untouched coffee. I didn't do anything, Lauren. Then how? I stopped, my mind racing. The cups. The switch. He must have seen me hesitate. Maybe he even knew before I handed him the coffee. James leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You're asking the wrong questions, he said softly. My pulse hammered in my ears. What's the right question then? His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Why did you do it? I froze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was Danielle's ragged breathing from the other room, the occasional muffled retch. James tilted his head, eyes narrowing just slightly. Go ahead, Lauren. Tell me. What was in the coffee? I forced myself to take a breath, to push down the rising panic. I had to regain control. I don't know what you're talking about, I said carefully. Maybe Danielle ate something bad last night. Maybe it's food poisoning. James let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You really think I'm that stupid? I opened my mouth, but before I could say anything, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A small plastic bag. My stomach lurched. Inside the bag was a crumpled receipt. He slid it across the table toward me. I stared at it, my hands refusing to move. Go on, James said. Take a look. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. My eyes darted over the details, my blood turning to ice. Purchased. Digitalis extract. Date 2 days ago. Paid with joint account, Harmon Family Checking. A shiver ran down my spine. James leaned back, watching me with quiet amusement. You left the receipt in your purse, he said. Sloppy. My mouth felt like sandpaper. Digitalis, he continued, almost casually. Foxglove. A heart stimulant in small doses. But too much. He clicked his tongue. Nausea, dizziness, vomiting. And if the dose is high enough. He trailed off, letting the words hang. My throat tightened. I had been so careful. Or at least I thought I had. I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. You're being ridiculous. I said, my voice stronger than I felt. You think I what? Poisoned my own sister. James tilted his head. No, he said simply. The breath I was holding escaped in a quiet rush. Then he smiled. I think you tried to poison me. My stomach plummeted. James tapped the receipt with 2 fingers. So Lauren, you can keep pretending, or you can start telling the truth. I clenched my fists under the table, nails biting into my palms. Danielle groaned from the bathroom, and James didn't even glance her way. He wasn't worried about her. He was only focused on me. I had lost control. And James knew it. James was still watching me, studying me. Danielle's muffled groans echoed from the bathroom, but she was no longer my biggest concern. The receipt sat between us like a loaded gun. Undeniable proof that I had planned something, that I had meant to hurt him. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my throat. My fingers curled so tightly into my lap that my nails dug into my skin. But I forced myself to stay calm. He wanted me to break. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. You're insane, I said, my voice steady. You think I'd do something like that? To you? To anyone? James didn't flinch. I think you bought Digitalis 2 days ago. He gestured toward the bathroom, where Danielle was still suffering. And I think you're scared because she drank it instead. I laughed, shaking my head. Listen to yourself, James. You sound crazy. Do I? He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. Then tell me why you bought it. I hesitated. That tiny pause, that split second where I didn't have an answer was all he needed. James exhaled through his nose, like he had just confirmed everything he already suspected. I needed to take back control. You know what? I don't have to explain myself, I said, pushing away from the table. This is ridiculous. My sister is sick, and you're sitting here acting like some detective in a crime novel. I'm going to check on her. I turned toward the bathroom, but James caught my wrist. Sit down, Lauren. His grip was firm, not rough, not painful, but enough to let me know I wasn't leaving this conversation. A slow shiver rolled down my spine. Let go of me. His fingers loosened, but he didn't move. Sit, he repeated, softer this time. For a long moment I stood there, pulse hammering in my ears. Then carefully I lowered myself back into the chair. James studied me again like he was peeling back layers I didn't even know I had. Tell me the truth, he said, or I will make sure you regret it. Something dark curled in my stomach. Not fear. Something else. I tilted my head, mirroring his movements. And what exactly do you think you can do to me, James? His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Try me and find out. I held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to be the first one to look away. This wasn't the man I married. Or maybe it was, and I had just never seen it before. Fine. If he wanted a confession, I'd give him one. Just not the one he expected. I sighed, letting my shoulders drop as if I was finally caving in. Okay, I said. You want the truth? Here it is. James leaned in slightly. I lowered my voice, forcing my eyes to glisten just enough. I bought the Digitalis because of Danielle. His brows furrowed slightly. He hadn't been expecting that. Good. She's been on my case for years. I continued, my voice trembling just enough to sound real. Always criticizing me. Always putting me down. She's toxic, James. I just wanted something to make her. Slow down. I swallowed hard. I never meant to hurt her. Just make her feel weak for once. So she'd stop treating me like I was nothing. James didn't respond. I let the silence stretch. Let my words settle in the air between us. Then I dropped my gaze, playing the part of a guilty woman. I'm sorry, I whispered. I was never going to use it. I don't know. I wanted to feel like I had some kind of control for once. Silence. Then James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. You expect me to believe that? I looked up, meeting his gaze again. It's the truth. A long pause. Then finally he leaned back, shaking his head. Jesus, Lauren. I pressed my hands into my lap, waiting. That's sick, he muttered. Even for you. I bit the inside of my cheek. I know. I needed him to believe me. I needed him to think that was all there was to it. That I had been reckless. Petty. A little twisted, sure. But not a murderer. Never a murderer. I watched as James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He was disgusted, sure. Maybe even furious. But the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly told me everything I needed to know. He believed me. For now. I forced a shaky breath and got up. I'm going to check on her. This time he didn't stop me. I walked toward the bathroom, my heartbeat steadying. This wasn't over. Not even close. James thought he had me figured out. But he had no idea. I paused just outside the bathroom door, pressing my palm flat against the cool wood. Danielle's weak groans seeped through the cracks, each one clawing at my nerves. This should have been James. This should have been him doubled over in pain, clutching his stomach, his body betraying him as I stood over him, whispering false reassurances. But instead, my sister lay behind that door, unknowingly suffering from a mistake that should never have happened. And James knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. I closed my eyes, forcing down the panic clawing its way up my throat. I had adjusted the story, given him a version of the truth he could latch onto. A twisted, petty move. Drugging my sister just to put her in her place. It made me look reckless. Petty. But not dangerous. Not capable of what I had actually planned. And now I had to double down on the lie. I pushed the door open and found Danielle slumped over the toilet, her forehead pressed against her arm. Sweat dotted her hairline, her usually sharp features twisted in pain. Jesus, Danielle, I murmured, kneeling beside her. You look awful. She let out a weak chuckle. Thanks. I grabbed a washcloth from the sink, running it under cool water before pressing it against the back of her neck. She sighed at the touch. I don't know what the hell is wrong with me. It just hit out of nowhere. I faked a concerned frown. Did you eat anything weird last night? Danielle shook her head. Just some sushi. But James had the same thing. He's fine. Of course he was fine. I had made sure of that. I needed to redirect. Plant a seed. Maybe it's a stomach bug, I suggested. Or stress. You've been working crazy hours lately. Danielle closed her eyes, exhaling sharply. Maybe. She was too exhausted to argue. Good. That meant she wasn't thinking too hard about it. I smoothed her damp hair back. Do you want me to call an ambulance? Danielle shook her head immediately. No. Just give me a minute. Perfect. The last thing I needed was doctors poking around running tests. I stayed with her for a while, rubbing soothing circles on her back, whispering meaningless reassurances. In another life, this might have even been real concern. Not today. Finally, after another 20 minutes, she sighed and pulled herself up. I think I just need sleep. I nodded. I'll set up the guest room for you. As I helped her out of the bathroom, I caught sight of James standing in the hallway, arms crossed. Watching. Always watching. His eyes flicked between me and Danielle, but he didn't say a word. I met his gaze, forcing myself to keep my expression open, honest. I knew what he was thinking. That I was trying too hard. That I was overcompensating. That I was guilty. But James had always been the type to overanalyze. To look for meaning in places where there wasn't any. And I would use that against him. I guided Danielle toward the guest room, leaving him standing there. Let him think he had me figured out. Let him believe he was still in control. Because the real game had only just begun. Danielle fell asleep almost immediately after I settled her into the guest room. Her body was still weak, her skin clammy, but the worst of it had passed. I knew the symptoms well. They wouldn't last much longer. She'd wake up groggy, maybe with a lingering headache, but she'd be fine. Fine. That was more than I could say for myself. I stepped out of the room and closed the door quietly behind me, only to find James still standing in the hallway. He hadn't moved, his arms still crossed, his expression unreadable. She's resting, I murmured, keeping my voice even. I think she'll be okay in a few hours. James didn't respond. He just stared at me, his gaze slow and deliberate, like he was peeling back every layer I had carefully built. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I refused to break first. Finally, he exhaled, shaking his head. You're a really good actress, Lauren. My pulse spiked, but I didn't flinch. Excuse me. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto mine. The way you're handling this. The way you're playing the perfect concerned sister. It's impressive, really. I forced a soft, bitter laugh. You're unbelievable, James. My sister gets sick in front of us, and your first instinct is to accuse me of something. His lips twitched, just the barest hint of amusement. I never said I was accusing you. I tilted my head, mirroring his movements. No, but you're thinking it. Aren't you? Another pause. Then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made my stomach turn. I think, he said, that you're a lot more careful than you let on. I inhaled sharply, willing my body to stay still, to not react. James studied me for a moment longer before finally stepping past me, heading down the hall. I'll be in my office, he muttered. I stood there unmoving until I heard his footsteps disappear down the stairs. Then and only then did I let my mask slip. I turned and pressed my hand against the wall, steadying myself. My breathing was shallow, my mind racing. James knew something. Maybe not everything. Maybe not enough. But enough to keep me on edge. I clenched my jaw, pushing off the wall. I wouldn't let him shake me. He wanted me nervous, wanted me second-guessing myself. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Straightening, I walked downstairs, heading toward the kitchen. I needed to keep up appearances, to act like nothing was wrong. I'd make some tea, check on Danielle later. Pretend like this morning had never happened. Like I hadn't almost. No. I pushed the thought away. I had to focus. I reached for the kettle, turning on the burner. As I did, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. James was standing in the doorway, watching me. Again. I clenched my fingers around the counter before turning to face him. You need something? I asked, keeping my tone light. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed once more. Yeah, actually. I raised a brow. And what's that? His lips curled slightly, but the amusement didn't reach his eyes. What were you planning to do after I died? My heart stopped. I gripped the counter tighter, forcing my breathing to stay even. Excuse me. James stepped forward, slow and controlled, his gaze locked onto mine. You put something in that coffee, Lauren. We both know it. So tell me, what was the plan? I swallowed. You're being ridiculous. He ignored me. Were you going to cry? Pretend to be the grieving widow? I forced out a dry laugh. James. Or were you going to act shocked? Call 911, play dumb, say you had no idea what happened. My fingers curled into my palm. Stop it. James stopped in front of me, so close I could see the slow rise and fall of his chest. Tell me the truth, Lauren, he murmured. What was I supposed to do after drinking that coffee? I glared up at him, forcing every ounce of defiance into my expression. You don't know what you're talking about. His eyes darkened. Don't I? The tension between us was suffocating. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought he might reach for me, shake me, do something, but then just as quickly he stepped back. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You know what? It doesn't even matter. I frowned. What? James let out a humorless laugh. Because now, Lauren, now I'm going to enjoy watching you squirm. My stomach twisted. He turned on his heel and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, cold dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't over. James wasn't just suspicious anymore. He wanted to play, and he was going to make sure I lost. James was changing. I had spent years underestimating him, assuming he was predictable, easy to manipulate, too set in his ways to ever see what was happening right in front of him. But now I saw it. The shift. The way he carried himself. The quiet amusement in his voice, the patience. This wasn't the same man I had married. This wasn't the quiet, exhausted husband who had spent years worshipping the ground I walked on. James had figured something out. And now he was playing with me. I gripped the kitchen counter, my nails digging into the smooth surface. I needed to get ahead of this. Danielle was still asleep, the poison wearing off just as expected. When she woke up, she wouldn't remember much. Only the nausea, the dizziness. Maybe she'd blame it on something she ate, which meant my immediate problem wasn't her. It was James. I don't think, Lauren, he said quietly. I know. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I held my ground, but something inside me shifted. James wasn't bluffing anymore. He had something. I needed to know what. You've been acting strange since this morning, I said, tilting my head slightly. Like you're waiting for me to slip up. James leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. You already slipped up. You just don't realize it yet. A slow, steady pressure built in my chest. I had been careful. Even when he caught the receipt, I had spun my way out of it. Hadn't I? I needed to test him. I sighed, rubbing my temples. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this isn't funny. Danielle got sick, and now you're using it as an excuse to mess with me. James studied me. That's what you think I'm doing? You're acting like some detective, accusing me of things without proof. I narrowed my eyes. Or do you have proof, James? He didn't answer right away. But then his lips curled, and slowly he reached into his pocket. My breath hitched as he pulled out a small black object. My stomach dropped. My voice came out quieter than I intended. What is that? James held it up between two fingers. A recording device. A recorder. My body locked up. You see, Lauren, he said, his voice almost gentle. I was up late last night. Couldn't sleep. So I went downstairs for some water. I couldn't breathe. And what do you know? He continued. My wife was already there, talking to herself. Or more accurately, he turned the device over in his palm. Practicing. Blood roared in my ears. Practicing. No, he couldn't. James pressed a button and suddenly my own voice filled the room. You just need to drink it, James. That's all. I sucked in a sharp breath. I'll be right here. I'll hold your hand. I'll make sure you're comfortable. And then you'll just drift off. The recording stopped. Silence. I could barely hear over the pounding of my heart. James tilted his head. I gotta say, Lauren, you almost had me fooled. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was checkmate. James leaned back against the couch, his smirk returning. Now, he murmured. Let's talk about what happens next. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with tension. I stared at the recorder in James's hand, my own voice still ringing in my ears. You just need to drink it, James. That's all. I'll be right here. I'll hold your hand. I'll make sure you're comfortable. And then you'll just drift off. I had been careful. So careful. But not careful enough. James had me. I needed to think. Fast. He leaned back, turning the small device between his fingers, savoring the moment. You know, he mused. I always wondered what you'd do if I pushed you far enough. If I really tested you. I forced a breath through my nose, keeping my voice level. You don't understand what you heard. James smirked. No? Then why don't you explain it to me? I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. The power dynamic tilting in his favor. I needed to regain control. I scoffed, shaking my head. You really think that's proof of something? That was nothing. Just me talking to myself. Working through my thoughts. I forced out a hollow laugh. You think I was actually planning something? Listen to yourself, James. That's insane. His smirk didn't waver. Then you won't mind if I send this to the police. A chill slithered down my spine. I knew he was bluffing. He had to be. The recording was damning, sure. But not enough. Not without real evidence. And James knew it. I lifted my chin, meeting his gaze. Go ahead, I said smoothly. Send it to them. Let's see how far you get with a recording of your wife talking to herself. His eyes narrowed just slightly. I had called his bluff. But he wasn't finished. James set the recorder down on the coffee table between us, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You know what I think, Lauren? I clenched my fingers in my lap, keeping my expression neutral. I'm sure you'll tell me. He smirked again, but his voice was quieter now. I think you were waiting for the right moment. I think you were planning to poison me for weeks. Maybe months. I swallowed hard. He was right, but he needed to believe he was wrong. I let out a sharp laugh, rolling my eyes. James, listen to yourself. Do you hear how ridiculous you sound? I love you. The words tasted bitter. James's smirk faded, his eyes hardening. No, you don't, he murmured. For the first time since this morning, a flicker of real emotion crossed his face. Not anger. Not suspicion. Something worse. Understanding. He knew. Maybe he didn't know everything. Maybe he couldn't prove it. But he knew. Silence stretched between us. Danielle was still asleep upstairs. The house was still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Finally, James exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You were really going to do it, weren't you?" he said softly. "You were actually going to kill me." I hesitated. Too long. James let out a humorless laugh. "Jesus Christ, Lauren. I needed to fix this." I leaned forward, forcing my voice to soften to crack just enough. "James, please. I never." He held up a hand. "Stop." I swallowed. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I just keep thinking. What if I didn't notice? What if I actually drank it?" I forced my lips into a wry smile. "Then you would have had a really bad stomachache, just like Danielle." His eyes snapped to mine, something sharp in his expression. There it was. The smallest misstep. The flicker of confirmation he had been waiting for. I had just admitted I knew Danielle was poisoned. James let out a slow breath. Huh. I felt the shift instantly. The game was over. He knew. I clenched my fists in my lap, keeping my face still, my breathing even. But James wasn't looking at me like I was his wife anymore. He was looking at me like I was his enemy. And I had just lost. The silence between us thickened, stretching out like a noose tightening around my neck. James leaned back, exhaling slowly, his fingers drumming against the armrest. I could see it in his eyes now, the shift, the absolute certainty. He wasn't just playing anymore. He had won. And now he was deciding what to do with me. I forced my hands to unclench, smoothing them over my thighs as if I were just casually adjusting my position. "You're being paranoid," I said, my voice measured, careful. "You hear a recording and suddenly you think I tried to kill you?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "You always overthink everything, James. It's exhausting." He smirked. But it wasn't amusement, it was something colder, something calculated. "You know what's exhausting," he murmured. "Spending years loving someone who was just waiting for the right moment to get rid of you." Something inside me twisted. Not guilt. Frustration. I had been so close to being free. James stood up, stretching like he wasn't in the middle of exposing his wife as a would-be murderer. "The funny thing is," he continued, "I spent a long time blaming myself for the way things turned out between us." He sighed, shaking his head. "I thought maybe I wasn't enough. That maybe I was boring, or too predictable. But now..." He glanced down at me, his expression unreadable. "Now I see I was just the obstacle in your way." I swallowed the sharp retort rising in my throat. Lashing out wouldn't help me now. I needed to be smart. "You're acting like I had some elaborate plan," I said, keeping my voice gentle, coaxing. "Like I've been plotting for years." "That's crazy, James." I laughed, shaking my head. "I love you." His smirk returned. But it was different now. Not amusement. Pity. "God, you're good," he murmured. "If I didn't know better, I'd almost believe you." A chill crawled up my spine. He turned away, pacing toward the window. "I've been thinking a lot about what to do next." My stomach tightened. "James," I started, but he ignored me. "If I go to the cops, I doubt they'll have enough to charge you." He gestured toward the recorder. A weird conversation at midnight? A drug that could have just been an accident? It's not airtight. I forced myself to stay still, to not show relief. "But," he continued, turning back to me, "it's enough to ruin you." My fingers twitched. James took a step closer, towering over me now. "Imagine what people will think, Lauren. Our friends. Your job. Everyone who ever thought you were this perfect, put-together woman." I felt my stomach turn to lead. "You wouldn't," I whispered. James tilted his head. "Wouldn't I?" I clenched my jaw, my nails digging into my palm. "What do you want?" A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. "Divorce." I blinked. Of all the things I had expected, that wasn't it. James leaned down slightly, just enough to be at eye level. "You're going to pack a bag. You're going to leave. And you're never going to fight me on it." My breath caught in my throat. "You're going to give me everything in the settlement." he continued, his voice calm even. The house. The cars. Every damn cent I've ever put into our life. He straightened up. And in return? I swallowed hard. I don't send this recording to everyone we know. My pulse pounded in my ears. You think you can blackmail me? I hissed. James chuckled. No, Lauren. His eyes darkened. I already am. I felt the walls closing in. The reality of my situation settling over me like a suffocating weight. This was worse than jail. Worse than getting caught. Because James wasn't destroying me in one swift blow. He was making sure I lived with it. That I knew every single day I had lost. And there was nothing I could do about it. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails nearly broke skin. You son of a... Careful, James murmured, stepping back. Wouldn't want to let that mask slip. I inhaled sharply, shaking with barely contained rage. He had me. And he knew it. James walked toward the hallway, pausing just before disappearing around the corner. Be gone by tonight, he said simply. Or I start making calls. And then just like that he was gone. Leaving me in the wreckage of my own damn game. I sat frozen in the living room. James's final words replaying in my mind like a sick joke. Be gone by tonight. Everything had unraveled so quickly. He wasn't supposed to win. He was supposed to be dead. I had planned every detail. The right dosage, the perfect timing. I had even rehearsed my reaction for when I found him slumped over his morning coffee, lifeless. The grieving widow. The shocked wife. It should have been flawless. But now, I was the one on the verge of losing everything. James had backed me into a corner. He had taken everything I had planned and turned it against me. Now I was the one being forced out. And the worst part? He was enjoying it. I gritted my teeth, digging my nails into my palm. My entire life had been carefully constructed. Every relationship, every opportunity, every move I made was about control. James was ripping that from me. I wouldn't let him. I took a deep breath, forcing my body to relax. I still had options. James thought he had one. He had no idea. Hours later, the house was quiet. Danielle was still resting in the guest room, and James was upstairs in his office, acting like he hadn't just turned my entire world upside down. I had spent the last few hours packing a single suitcase, just enough to make it look like I was actually leaving. James wanted me gone by tonight. So that's exactly what I'd let him believe. I zipped up the bag and set it by the door, taking my time, making sure he heard me. Footsteps creaked above me. He was listening. Good. I glanced at the clock. 8:45 p.m. It was almost time. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filling it with water. My fingers trailed over the counter, over the coffee machine. The same one I had used this morning when I had tried to kill my husband. I had been sloppy today. Too many emotions, too much hesitation. I wouldn't make that mistake again. Because James wasn't the only one who had a final move to play. I took out my phone and scrolled to a text thread I had been careful to keep hidden. The name at the top of the screen made my stomach twist, but I ignored it. I had stopped feeling guilt a long time ago. I typed quickly, my fingers steady. It's done. He thinks I'm leaving. I need you to meet me at the house. I hit send. A few seconds later my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Are you sure? I smirked. Trust me. It's time. James thought I was out of options. But I had been playing this game far longer than he realized. And by the time the night was over, one of us wouldn't be waking up tomorrow. The end.